You know, we all think we know the story of the Titanic. But what if I told you that familiar tale of an unsinkable ship and a tragic accident? Well, it isn't the whole story, not even close. The truth is, the Titanic sinking wasn't just some unavoidable accident. It was a disaster that could have been prevented, caused by a whole cascade of failures. So let's dive in and look at the real evidence.
You know, the people who have spent their lives studying this disaster, they all come to the same conclusion. There wasn't one single reason for what happened. This wasn't about one mistake. No, it was a chain reaction, kind of like a perfect storm where human error, terrible luck, and hidden flaws all collided on that one single fateful night. In this explainer, we're going to break down that chain, link by link. And this, right here, is the heart of what we're looking at today. We're going to shift our thinking away from the myth of some random, tragic accident and toward the reality of a preventable catastrophe, one that honestly could have been stopped at so many different points along the way. Okay, so let's set the scene real quick. Back in 1912, the Titanic was the biggest man-made moving object on the planet. I mean, this thing was a true technological marvel, the absolute last word in luxury and safety. And famously, of course, everyone considered it unsinkable. It was this huge symbol of humanity's triumph over nature.
And yet, on its very first voyage, this unsinkable ship went down, taking almost 1,500 people with it. The sheer scale of that loss is just staggering, and it's why we're still so fascinated by this story more than a century later. It's also why getting the facts right really matters.
So for decades, the story that we all grew up with was incomplete. The first investigations, they had to rely on survivor testimonies, which were often conflicting. You can imagine why. But the most critical piece of evidence, the ship itself, was totally out of reach, lost in the abyss.
Just think about that for a second. For 73 years, the truth was just sitting there on the ocean floor. It wasn't until 1985, when the wreck was finally discovered, that investigators could actually analyze the physical evidence. And that discovery, it changed absolutely everything we thought we knew.
Okay, so let's start with that chain of events we talked about. The first part of this whole preventable disaster is this incredible cascade of human errors and just plain bad luck that put this modern marvel on a direct collision course with destiny.
It really was a domino effect. First, the captain kept the ship going at nearly full speed. We're talking 22 knots, even though they got ice warnings from 14 other ships. Then, you've got this dangerously deceptive night. The sea was perfectly calm, there was no moon, which meant there was none of that white surf you'd normally see breaking against an iceberg, and to top it all off, the lookouts in the crow's nest had no binoculars. Why? Because the key to the locker they were in was accidentally taken ashore by an officer who got replaced right before the ship set sail.
But here's the thing, human error and bad luck were only part of the story. There was a fatal flaw literally built into the ship itself. For decades, this myth existed about how the iceberg actually damaged the Titanic, while the physical evidence from the wreck completely rewrites that story.
Now this is the big aha moment. We've all seen the movies, right? This massive 300-foot gash tearing the hull open like a tin can. But the reality, which we found out from sonar probes of the wreck, was totally different. The real damage was just 6 small, separate splits, and if you put them all together, their total area was no bigger than a single front door.
So that raises the biggest question of all, doesn't it? If the damage was that small, why on earth did the unsinkable ship sink? And the answer to that question led investigators to the Titanic's hidden and very fatal flaw.
The culprit wasn't the ship's high-quality steel plates. Those actually held up pretty well, buckling and bending like they were supposed to. Nope, it was the rivets, the thousands of little metal pins holding all those plates together. Specifically, weaker wrought iron rivets that were used in the ship's bow. They got super brittle in the freezing water, and when the iceberg hit, they just popped open. The best analogy, it was like buttons popping off a shirt.
See, to keep up with their crazy construction schedule, the builders made a fateful choice. They used stronger, machine-driven steel rivets on the easy-to-reach middle part of the hull, but for the tricky, curved sections at the bow and the stern, they used weaker wrought iron rivets that had to be put in by hand. And of course, the iceberg just happened to strike the bow, the ship's weakest point. Some of these rivets had up to 40% slag, a waste material, when the acceptable level was just 3%.
So the ship has now suffered a fatal blow. But to really understand why the rescue became so critical, so fast, you have to look at the math of the damage. This is the moment the sinking became absolutely inevitable.
Because those weak rivets popped, the iceberg's impact breached 6 of the ship's watertight compartments. 6.
And that number is the key. The Titanic was an engineering marvel, specifically designed to stay afloat with up to 4 of its compartments flooded. 4 would have been fine, but 6? Breaching 6 compartments sealed its fate. The unsinkable ship was now guaranteed to sink, which made a fast rescue the only hope for everyone on board.
And this is where the story just becomes a heartbreaking tragedy of timing. At 11:23 p.m., the closest ship, the SS Californian, had stopped for the night because of the ice fields and turned its radio off. Just 17 minutes later, the Titanic hits the iceberg. By the time the distress calls start going out, the Californian's radio room is completely silent. Help was less than 20 miles away, but the call just went unheard.
All right, so let's pull all these threads together now and deliver the final verdict on this century-old case. What really sank the Titanic?
Well, the truth is, there was no single smoking gun. It was this perfect storm of failure. You had overconfidence that led to dangerous speed. You had unlucky weather that hid the iceberg. You had a tiny misplaced key that left the lookouts effectively blind, a hidden flaw in the very rivets holding the ship together, and a radio on a nearby ship being turned off just minutes too soon.
And as one investigator summed it up perfectly, take out any of those links and you could have prevented it. The disaster wasn't inevitable. Not at all. It was a chain of failures, and breaking just one of those links in the chain could have changed history forever.
So that brings us to our final question, and I'll leave you with this to think about. Now that you've seen the whole chain of events, from the captain's choices all the way down to the chemical makeup of the rivets, was the sinking of the Titanic really just a freak accident, or should it be remembered as one of history's greatest and most tragic examples of preventable human error?